Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Picture the year 1918. It is a world defined by the jagged edges of rusted barbed wire and the suffocating smell of mustard gas. The Great War, the conflict that was supposed to end all wars, has been grinding the youth of Europe into the mud for 4 years. But as the autumn leaves begin to turn, a new horror emerges from the fog of war. It is silent, invisible, and far deadlier than any machine gun or artillery shell. It starts with a cough, a sudden spike in fever, and a bone-deep ache. Within hours, young, healthy soldiers are turning blue from a lack of oxygen. They drown in their own fluids, their lungs collapsing under the weight of a microscopic invader. It sweeps through the trenches, leaps across oceans on troop transport ships, and infiltrates the bustling cities of the home front. By the time the fever breaks 2 years later, at least 50 million people are dead. Some estimates say the number is closer to 100 million. It is the greatest medical holocaust in human history. And for the last century, we have called it the Spanish flu. When you hear that name, you probably conjure up a specific narrative. You imagine a virus springing to life in the dust of Castile or the streets of Madrid. You imagine it sweeping out of the Iberian Peninsula to infect the rest of the world. It is right there in the name, after all. We have the West Nile virus, Lyme disease from Lyme, Connecticut, and the Ebola virus from the Ebola River. We name diseases after their point of origin. It is a way of cataloging our fears, of putting a pin in the map where the nightmare began. So, for generations, history textbooks and popular culture have reinforced this idea. Spain was the villain. Spain was the petri dish. It is a convenient story. It gives a geographic face to an invisible enemy. But what if I told you that story is a lie? What if I told you that the so-called Spanish flu had absolutely nothing to do with Spain, other than the fact that they were the only ones honest enough to talk about it? The reality of the 1918 pandemic is not a story about Spanish biology. It is a story about American farms, French trenches, and a global conspiracy of silence. It is a story about how the machinery of war crushed the truth and how a neutral nation was framed for a crime it didn't commit simply because it refused to lie to its citizens. Welcome to Half-Truths. I am your host, and today we are going to scrub the ink off the history books and look at what was really written underneath. We are going to find out why the deadliest virus in modern history should probably be called the Kansas flu. To understand why we got the story so wrong, we first have to appreciate just how deeply ingrained the myth is. The name Spanish flu is one of the most successful branding exercises of the 20th century. It stuck almost immediately. In 1918, people were terrified. They were already traumatized by years of industrial warfare, and suddenly, their neighbors were dropping dead in the streets. They needed an explanation. They needed a source. In May of 1918, the wire services began buzzing with reports from Madrid. The headlines were sensational. A strange illness had paralyzed the Spanish capital. Even King Alfonso XIII had fallen ill. Government offices were closing. The trams stopped running because there were no drivers. It sounded apocalyptic. Because these reports were coming out of Spain, and because they were so detailed and alarming, the rest of the world looked at the map, pointed a finger, and said, "There. That is where it is coming from. It is the Spanish lady, the Spanish influenza." This narrative was comforting in a dark way. If it is Spanish, then it is foreign. It is something from over there that came over here. It fit the xenophobic anxieties of the time. It allowed the belligerent nations of the war, the British, the French, the Germans, and the Americans, to externalize the threat. It wasn't our filth in the trenches that caused this. It wasn't our overcrowded barracks. It was them. This belief was so pervasive that even today, when we look back at the black and white photos of police officers wearing gauze masks in Seattle or nurses tending to rows of cots in gymnasium hospitals, the caption almost always reads, "Spanish flu." It has become shorthand for the event itself. It is a half-truth that has ossified into a fact. We accept it without question because it has been repeated for 100 years. But if you pull on the thread, if you look at the timeline of infection, the Spanish theory falls apart instantly. The outbreak in Madrid happened in May 1918, but by that time, the virus had already been tearing through armies in France and training camps in the United States for months. The timeline is wrong. The geography is wrong. The entire premise is backward. So, if the virus didn't start in Spain, why did everyone think it did? To answer that, we have to leave the realm of medicine and enter the realm of politics, specifically the brutal, cynical politics of total war. In 1918, the Great War was in a stalemate. The Allies and the Central Powers were exhausted. Morale was hanging by a thread. Governments on both sides knew that maintaining the will to fight was just as important as ammunition. If the soldiers believed they were doomed, they would stop fighting. If the civilians back home believed the war was bringing a plague, they would stop buying war bonds. Information was a weapon, and it was strictly controlled. The United States had passed the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it a crime to say, print, or publish anything disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive about the form of government of the United States. In practice, this meant you couldn't publish bad news that might hurt the war effort. The British had the Defense of the Realm Act. The French and Germans had their own draconian censorship laws. Now, imagine you are a newspaper editor in London, Paris, or Berlin. You start hearing reports of a strange flu wiping out entire battalions. You hear that hospitals in the staging areas are overflowing. Do you print that story? Absolutely not. That is treason. That is aiding the enemy. If you tell the Germans that the British Army is incapacitated by the flu, you are giving them a tactical advantage. If you tell the American public that their boys are dying of pneumonia before they even reach the front, you are destroying support for the war. So, the press and the warring nations stayed silent. They buried the obituaries. They attributed deaths to pneumonia or routine sickness. They scrubbed the pandemic from the headlines to protect the war effort. But Spain was different. Spain was neutral. They weren't fighting the Germans or the Allies. They didn't have a wartime censor breathing down their necks. They had a free press. So, when the virus arrived in Madrid, the Spanish newspapers did what newspapers are supposed to do. They reported the news. They wrote about the overflowing hospitals. They wrote about the king getting sick. They wrote about the panic in the streets. The rest of the world was starving for information, but their own media was feeding them a diet of propaganda. Suddenly, here comes a flood of honest reporting from Spain. The international wire services picked up the Spanish stories because they were the only stories available. People in Manchester and Chicago and Lyon read these reports and thought, wow, Spain is really getting hit hard. They didn't realize that their own neighbors were dying of the exact same thing because their own newspapers weren't allowed to tell them. The virus was everywhere, but the news of the virus was only coming from Spain. It is a classic case of survivorship bias in data. We saw the virus in Spain because that is where the light was shining. The rest of the world was in the dark. The name Spanish flu was not a medical diagnosis. It was a byproduct of censorship. It was a lie of omission that the whole world agreed to believe because it was convenient. This brings us to the true detective story of this episode. If Spain was just the scapegoat, where did the killer actually come from? There are a few theories. Some virologists have looked at a respiratory illness in China in late 1917. Others point to a major British troop staging camp in Étaples, France, which was filled with pigs and poultry, the perfect mixing vessel for avian and swine flus. But the most compelling evidence, the evidence that many modern historians and epidemiologists now lean toward, points to a place that is about as far removed from the exotic streets of Madrid as you can get. It points to Haskell County, Kansas. Let's go there. It is January 1918. Haskell County is a desolate, windswept patch of farming communities in the southwest corner of the state. The people there live in sod houses. They raise pigs and cattle. It is isolated, rugged, and quiet. In this quiet county lives a country doctor named Loring Minor. Dr. Minor is not your average rural physician. He is intellectually curious. He keeps up with the latest medical journals, and he has a laboratory in his office. He is a man of science on the frontier. In late January and early February of 1918, Dr. Minor begins to see patients with strange symptoms. This isn't the normal seasonal flu. It strikes with violent speed. The strongest young farmers are being knocked flat. Their temperatures spike to 104, 105 degrees. But it is the pneumonia that scares him. It moves so fast. Dozens of people in this sparsely populated county fall ill. 3 of them die. That might not sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but Dr. Minor knows his community. He knows this is aberrant. This is something new. He is so concerned that he does something remarkable for a country doctor in 1918. He writes a report. He contacts the United States Public Health Service. He warns them that there is a new, violent type of influenza circulating in Haskell County. His report is the first recorded instance of the virus that would eventually kill millions. But it is 1918. The Public Health Service is underfunded and distracted by the war. They file Dr. Minor's report away and ignore it. If the virus had stayed in Haskell County, it might have burned itself out. The population was too low to sustain a massive epidemic. The virus needed a bridge. It needed a way to get from the isolated farms of Kansas to the crowded cities of the world. The war provided that bridge. In late February, young men from Haskell County were drafted. They said goodbye to their families, packed their bags, and traveled 300 miles east to Camp Funston, which is part of the massive Fort Riley military base. Camp Funston was a virus's dream come true. It was overcrowded, with 56,000 men living in close quarters. The barracks were cold and drafty. The men were stressed and exhausted from training. On March 4, 1918, just days after the boys from Haskell County arrived, a cook at Camp Funston reported to the infirmary with a fever and a headache. By noon, the infirmary had over 100 cases. Within weeks, thousands of soldiers were sick. This was the first wave. It was bad, but it wasn't the apocalypse yet. Most of the men recovered. But here's the tragedy. These men were being trained for deployment. They were being moved like chess pieces across the country and then across the Atlantic. Soldiers from Camp Funston were transferred to other army camps in the south and east coast. They took the virus with them. Then they boarded the troop ships. Imagine the hold of a World War I transport ship. It is a floating incubator. Thousands of men packed into unventilated spaces, coughing on each other for a week straight while crossing the ocean. By the time these ships docked in Brest or Southampton, the virus was rampant. The American soldiers brought the Kansas virus to the trenches of France. There, it met the conditions of the Western Front. The trenches were a biological cesspool. Mustard gas damaged the soldiers' lungs, making them more susceptible. The constant stress weakened their immune systems. In this environment, the virus mutated. It learned. It became deadlier. This is where the mild virus from Kansas transformed into the monster that would consume the world. It ripped through the British and French armies. It crossed the lines and infected the Germans. It was likely a major factor in the failure of the final German offensives in the summer of 1918. General Ludendorff, the German commander, blamed the flu for stalling his war machine. So, while the world was reading about the Spanish flu in May and June, the virus had actually been born in the American Midwest months earlier, incubated in U.S. Army camps, and radicalized in the trenches of France. The irony is staggering. The United States, the country that eventually tipped the balance of the war with its fresh troops, also supplied the biological agent that nearly destroyed all the armies involved. And yet, for decades, nobody talked about Kansas. The narrative was locked in. It was Spanish. There is another layer to this tragedy that makes the half-truth even more bitter. The attribution to Spain didn't just obscure the origin, it obscured the lesson. By calling it the Spanish flu, the world treated it like a foreign invader, an act of nature, something that just happened to us. If we had called it the army camp flu or the trench flu, we would have been forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the pandemic was man-made, not in a laboratory, but by the very structure of our society at that moment. We built the supply chains that distributed it. We built the barracks that incubated it. We censored the news that could have warned people to quarantine. The Great War created the perfect ecological niche for a supervirus, and then the political machinery of the war ensured it spread as efficiently as possible. The refusal to acknowledge the American origin was partly patriotic defensiveness. Nobody wants to be the patient zero nation, but it was also a failure of imagination. It was easier to blame the exotic other than to look in the mirror. Dr. Loring Minor, the doctor in Haskell County, lived to see the devastation. He watched as the virus he tried to warn the world about killed more people than the Black Death. He knew what he had seen. He knew where it started. But his voice was drowned out by the roar of the war and the convenient lie of the Spanish flu. It took decades of detective work by historians like John M. Barry to dig up Dr. Minor's old reports and connect the dots between the Haskell County farms and the global catastrophe. Science eventually caught up with history. Genetic reconstruction of the 1918 virus has shown it was an avian origin H1N1 virus. And while we can never be 100% certain of the precise bird that passed it to a human, the epidemiological trail from Kansas to the camps to Europe is the strongest narrative we have. So, where does that leave us? We live in a world where information travels faster than ever, but misinformation travels just as fast. The story of the Spanish flu is a warning. It teaches us that names matter. Labels matter. When we misidentify the source of a problem, we fail to understand the mechanics of the problem itself. If we think a virus is just a random curse from a distant land, we feel helpless. But if we understand that it was a product of overcrowding, poor sanitation, global troop movements, and censorship, we realize that we played a hand in our own destruction. The half-truth is that the Spanish flu was a global tragedy reported by Spain. The whole truth is that it was a catastrophe of our own making, hidden by our own governments, and fueled by a war that we refuse to stop. We often say that truth is the first casualty of war. In 1918, that wasn't just a metaphor. The suppression of the truth literally killed millions of people. The censors, who protected morale by silencing the news of the virus, thought they were saving the war effort. In reality, they were helping the virus win. Next time you hear someone mention the Spanish flu, remember Dr. Loring Minor in the desolate plains of Kansas. Remember the young boys at Camp Funston. And remember that the most dangerous thing in a crisis isn't always the threat itself. Sometimes it is the silence we construct around it. It wasn't the Spanish flu. It was the First World War flu, but we didn't have the courage to name it after the darkness that created it. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.